Last June 20th, I gave a talk called What Does Childlike Faith Mean to Me? And I shared a few stories, four of them exact, from my childhood and what I learned about faith. These are stories of God working in my life when I was a young boy and up to 8th grade. Now, when I finished that message, several people wanted to know what happened next. I shared a little bit about what God did in my life as a boy, but they want to know what God did with me as I grew older. So that's where the motivation for this message came from. I'm going to talk about what does grown-up faith mean to me, because 8th grade is when my faith really started to grow up, and God continued to teach me lessons, and I'll share a few of them with you. So the first thing is that when your faith grows up, it's still childlike. The beauty of childlike faith never goes away. And the lessons that you learned as a child, they should still ring true, unless you had a misconception as a child that was corrected. But I shared a long list of lessons last week, or not last week, but back in June. And as a boy, I learned that God exists, that God is good, God answers prayer, God works in our lives, God forgives, we can trust God, we should obey God, we should love everybody, we should pray for others, we shouldn't be selfish, things like that. Now, in 8th grade, that's when my faith started to grow up, and I learned a couple important lessons with the story that I shared back in June. Everything we do should be for God's glory, and God gives us evidence and help when we need it along the way. Now, but the most important thing about childlike faith was that I'm still learning lessons from God. It never stops. Childlike faith means that we're eager to learn. We never stop. Now, grown-up faith is not childish. Being childlike is not the same as being childish. And let me explain what that means. When I made this commitment in 8th grade, um, spiritual discipline started in my life. I was committed to not just attending church because my parents made me go, but I wanted to get as much out of church as I could. I began reading the Bible every day, and not just reading it casually, but studying it, wanting to know what the Bible really meant. I committed to daily prayer, having time set aside for prayer, but also trying to develop a habit of talking to God throughout my day. And that was actually a lot easier to do as a boy than it is as an adult. Um, but those are spiritual disciplines, and grown-up faith incorporates spiritual disciplines like that. Um, Later on, as I continued to grow in my faith, I learned to persevere through difficulty. I learned to forgive others. I learned the importance of good works. Um, but I learned that being a Christian wasn't just about doing good things. We should be developing a pure heart and growing stronger in character. There were a lot of lessons that came with growing up in my faith. I'd like to share a few scriptures related to growing up. The first one comes from Luke 2:52. Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. To me, if Jesus grew in his faith, and he was the Son of God, that's pretty strong evidence that I should be growing in my faith too. The next one is from Paul in his letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 13:11. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. Now, the context for that verse is right in the middle of the love chapter. So Paul is letting us know that he's not talking about development from physically from a child to a man. He's talking about his spiritual development. And he's saying that we should grow out of childish ways and become more mature in our faith. And that growth is very much related to true love. In 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy, love keeps no record of wrongs. All these things that 1 Corinthians 13 is famous for, those are part of growing up in our faith. The key verse that I'd like to focus on for this talk, it comes from Hebrews 5:11 through 14. We have much to say about this, but it is hard to make it clear to you because you no longer try to understand. You need someone to teach you the elementary truths. Milk, not solid food. Being still an infant, solid food is for the mature, who have trained themselves. Now, in this passage, Paul is making it clear that or not Paul, whoever wrote Hebrews, we don't really know if that was Paul or not. But the author of Hebrews is making it clear that we're not supposed to stay in spiritual infancy. We should be maturing in our faith. Um, and he also points out that the reason these people aren't maturing in their faith is because they no longer try to understand. They've lost their desire to learn. They've lost that childlike quality. Even though they're spiritual infants, they've lost that childlike quality of being eager to learn. And finally, he says that the mature have trained themselves. If you want to grow up in your faith, it involves some training. There's another passage that Paul wrote to Timothy, 1 Timothy 4:8. He writes that physical training is of some value, but godliness, which is spiritual training, has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. So Paul is telling Timothy that spiritual training, as we grow in our faith and become more godly, that's kind of like physical training for an athlete. It's a little bit intense, and it requires discipline and effort. Okay, the story that I'd like to share comes from 1977. It was in between my freshman and sophomore year in high school when our family took a vacation, a road trip out west. We drove through the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, across Wisconsin, Minnesota, into South Dakota. We visited Mount Rushmore, Crazy Horse, the South Dakota Badlands. I even have a picture of the Badlands here. That's me in the colored shirt and my brother hiking through the Badlands with me. So we went through Wyoming, saw some interesting things there. In Colorado, we stopped at Rocky Mountain National Park. We visited the Garden of Gods. That was really awesome. But we went to the Air Force Academy. And at the Air Force Academy, I was impressed with the beautiful campus there. It's a really awesome place. But I was more impressed with the cream of the crop cadets that they have there. I read about how high school seniors from all over the country who are at the top of their class academically, excelling in athletics, and demonstrating leadership capabilities are brought there to become future leaders of the Air Force. And that was kind of very impressive to me. That wasn't me, though. At that time in my life, in my ninth grade year, I got pretty good grades, but I wasn't at the top of my class, and I wasn't athletic at all. I ran track, but I finished last in every race I ran. Um, and I was a real shy kid. I didn't demonstrate leadership qualities at all. So as I was admiring the qualities of these cadets, these future leaders, I was kind of contrasting to get that against me. I am not one of those at all. Well, on Sunday morning, our family went to the cadet chapel. I have a picture of the cadet chapel here. You've probably seen that before. It's a pretty famous building. But our family went to the cadet chapel, and it was mostly tourists. In the summer, there are a lot of tourists who go to the cadet chapel services. And I remember we were singing a hymn. We were all standing there. I was there with my mom and dad, my brother and sister, holding a hymn book, singing a song. And all of a sudden, the tourists all disappeared. My mom and dad, brother and sister, they all disappeared. I was standing there surrounded by cadets in their dark blue service dress uniform. And I was one of them. I was a cadet wearing a dark blue service dress uniform. And this wasn't a daydream. I wasn't imagining this. This was out of the blue. It just hit me. It overcame me. And it was like a hallucination. It only lasted about half a second. It was there and it was gone, but it left me in shock. I looked around and it felt weird to me that all these people that had been there before were still there singing. They didn't experience this vision that I saw. But this was very vivid to me. And it was as if I was actually seeing it. Of course, it wasn't actually there. It was something in my mind. But I didn't know where it came from. It was a bit alarming to me. I thought about that vision for the next month, and then it kind of drifted from my mind, except when I prayed. Every time I prayed, something made me think about that vision. So I asked God, Lord, is this from you? Are you trying to tell me something? And I sensed the Holy Spirit saying, yeah. And when I asked what it was, that's your future. You're going to go there. Now, that just seemed absurd to me. I didn't really believe it. But this vision and the memory of the vision just kept nudging me. God was nudging me gently, saying, yep, you're going. That's where you're going to go. So after a while, I decided to tell my mom that I was going to go to the Air Force Academy. I accepted the nudge from God, and even though it seemed impossible, I knew God could do the impossible. So I said, okay, God, I'll apply for the Air Force Academy. When I told my mom, she was gracious. She could have laughed and said, that's ridiculous, because it was. um, But she graciously said, "Do you have a backup plan?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm thinking of going to Michigan State and studying agriculture or maybe forestry." I was interested in those things. Uh, but I really felt like God was going to get me to the Air Force Academy. I was feeling confident. Now, it required miraculous provision. Um, my junior year in high school, I took the preliminary scholastic aptitude test. And this is one of the pieces of data that the Air Force Academy requires. I sent a pre-candidate questionnaire with my scores, and my science and math scores were pretty strong, but my English score was just a little above average. And the Air Force Academy sent a letter back saying, "Thank you for your interest, but you don't meet our minimum qualifications." They held out hope, though. They said, "If you want to take the SAT later and those scores are better, you can still apply." So I was confident that God would make my SAT scores better, and I took those in the fall of my senior year. We're talking 1979 now. And I did a little bit better in math and science, and I did a whole lot better in English. I sent the scores to the Air Force Academy, and they said, "All right, you qualify, you can apply." Well, one of the early things that happen in the application process is what they call a physical aptitude examination, a PAE. If I remember right, this was in early June when I took my PAE. I was an athlete, not a great athlete, but I was reasonable in reasonable physical condition. I did good in the chin-ups, the sit-ups, the push-ups, standing broad jump, the run. But when it came to this quirky test that they called the basketball throw, I failed. I had to sit on my knee or kneel on my knees and throw the ball with one hand as far as I could. And I wasn't a basketball player, you know. I could throw the ball pretty good with two hands, but on my knees with one hand, I just failed. So they sent me another letter that said, "Thank you for your interest, but you do not meet our minimum standards. If you want to continue as an applicant, you need to reschedule the PAE and try again." So I rescheduled it in January this time. Now, if I remember right, the makeup PAE was on a Wednesday, and I was pretty confident that I could pass. Every day I went out in our backyard and I got on my knees and I threw the basketball. I'd go get it and I'd throw it back and forth over and over again. Even in the snow, I was out there throwing this basketball, and I had developed the coordination. It probably got a little bit stronger, but mainly it was an issue of coordination. And I had pretty much doubled the length of my throw, so I was confident I could pass. Well, on Saturday before the PAE, I hyperextended my elbow in a wrestling match. There was a tournament that weekend, and I injured it pretty bad. I was still able to pass everything in the PAE except chin-ups. I had to do my chin-ups primarily with my right arm. I couldn't pull much with my left arm because of the hyperextended elbow, and my right arm alone wasn't strong enough to pass. So I got another letter from the Air Force Academy saying, "Thank you for your interest, but you don't meet our minimum qualifications. Your chin-up score was too low." This time there was no recourse. This was the end. We don't want you. Good luck with your life. Well, my wrestling coach was pretty upset. He was energized, and he went to bat for me. He called the Air Force Academy. I think he sent a letter out there, and Jerry Papazian became an instrument for God's provision, God's miraculous provision in getting me into the Air Force Academy. The officials out there listened to him, and they took his word for it. They sent me a letter and said, "We're waiving your PAE. You can continue your application." So that was great. I did. And I actually got the appointment. The first week in April, I received a letter saying, "Congratulations, you've been appointed to the United States Air Force Academy." And it was really funny because when I got that letter, my leg was in a cast. I had torn two ligaments in wrestling practice, and I needed major surgery to repair that knee. The surgeon promised me that he would get me ready for basic training. Basic training started on Monday, June 23rd, and he said, "I can get you ready. Trust me." So I did. Well, when I got my appointment letter, I was in a cast. A couple weeks later, and I think it was after the cast was off, I got another letter. And this letter said that if you've suffered any major injuries or illness since your physical examination for the Air Force, please fill out this form and explain them to us. And this knee surgery was a major thing. I couldn't just ignore it. I had to put it in the form. And in the comments section of the form, I explained that my surgeon had promised that he could put me on an accelerated fast track physical therapy program and I'd be ready for basic training June 23rd. Well, the Air Force Academy disagreed. They sent me another "thank you very much for your interest" letter, but we don't want you. They said that knee injuries like this do not do well under the rigors of the Air Force Academy. And there was no recourse. There was no offer to go some other route to get to the Air Force Academy. It didn't even sound like they wanted me to try applying again the next year. That was it. They don't want me. Well, my surgeon, the knee surgeon, was pretty upset with that. He sent some letters out and called and pushed the medical experts out there. He told them that he had done this surgery routinely. He had helped athletes recover and go back to their sports and excel in their sports with the surgery they did in my knee. And he said I was doing really well, that I'd be ready. So they didn't really agree to let me come. But on June 19th, this was a Thursday, the Department of Defense Medical Examination Review Board, also known as the DODMERB, met, and they reviewed my case. Basic training was the following Monday, only 4 days later. I didn't know they were meeting, but while they were meeting, I was out running. I went and I ran 3 miles and I timed myself, and my goal had been to get under 20 minutes. I wanted to be able to run 3 miles in 19 minutes and some seconds. But I just wasn't there. I was working really hard, doing my best, and I was actually recovering very rapidly, but not as good as I thought I needed to. I timed myself for this 3 miles. It was over 21 minutes. I think it's just a little bit over 21 minutes, but that didn't sound good to me. As a cross-country runner, I thought I should be able to do a lot better. Well, when I got home, I ran. I went right in the house without stopping to catch my breath, and Dad was on the phone, and he's motioning for me. He's motioning for me to come. So I came over to him. He's talking on the phone, and then he stops and says, "It's the DODMERB. They want to speak with you." Well, I'm still breathing hard. I get on the phone, and the guy talking to me says, "I've got you on speakerphone. The whole DODMERB is here listening to you. We want to hear a few things from you about your condition." So I apologized because I was panting in the phone. I was still out of breath. I said, "I just finished running 3 miles and I'm still breathing hard. I'm sorry about that." Um, and the guy I'm talking to said, "You just ran 3 miles?" He sounded a little bit surprised. And it didn't clue into me that that was unusual for somebody that had just had the kind of surgery I had. I was still embarrassed that I was running so slow. But I felt I needed to be honest. I wanted to tell him I ran in 18 minutes or something great like that, but I had to tell the truth. I told him I ran in, I said, it took me 21 minutes and 7 seconds, or whatever the seconds was, I don't remember. And I was real embarrassed. In fact, I felt more nervous at this point than I had since I decided to apply for the Air Force Academy. I had been confident that God was going to get me there, but at this point, with these doctors putting me on speakerphone and it taking me so long to run 3 miles, I felt really nervous. I thought, maybe I'm not going to go. Well, the doctor talked to me for a couple of minutes, and he asked me to wait on hold, and it seemed like a long time. The phone went silent. I'm waiting there, and finally the guy comes back, and he says, "We're going to let you report to basic training, but we're not going to agree to admit you until we examine you in person. So come on out here next Monday and start the basic training check-in process, and we'll pull you out and give you a physical examination." Well, they did. When the doctor examined me, he kind of scratched his head and said, "You owe your surgeon a huge thank you. He worked a miracle on this knee." The guy could not believe the size of my muscles and the strength of my leg, and that I could do the things I could do with my leg. And I was almost fully recovered. He was just shocked. Well, the surgeon did a great job, but the miracle went to God. And I think God did miraculously touch my knee and help me to heal. It was unprecedented, the extent that I was able to heal. So that's not the end of the story, though. I went through basic training. They warned my flight commander that I had had surgery recently, and he was supposed to keep an eye out on me. But the only thing I missed was I got pulled out in the middle of a flicker ball game, and I wasn't allowed to finish the flicker ball game because my flight commander noticed me limping a little bit. I tried to hide it, but I was limping a little bit. But there was very little pain in my knee, and I was actually in better shape than most of my classmates. Basic training went really well physically. My knee did not get in the way. Now, that fall, it was October, November time frame, I went to the cadet chapel, and I'd been going there every Sunday, and I usually sat on the left side because that's where our family usually sat growing up. It was a habit for me, but for some reason this Sunday I sat on the right side. And I was surrounded by cadets. It was a typical school chapel morning. There were cadets there worshiping, and we were singing a hymn. I had my hymn book out, and all of a sudden it hit me. I was sitting in the same pew, in the same position that I had been in 3.5 years before with my family. The vision had come true exactly as I saw it 3.5 years previously. I don't remember the hymn, but I suspect that it was even the same hymn. I believe that God gave me a vision. It was only like half a second, but I saw the future for that half second. And that is a miracle. Now, I don't think God performs miracles just for fun. Maybe he does occasionally, but usually when God performs a miracle, he's trying to teach us something. And I learned a lot of lessons through this miraculous provision of God, getting me into the Air Force Academy and telling me in advance that he was going to do it. It strengthened my faith, of course, but it also prepared me for a lifetime of skepticism. I am gifted with analytical thinking and problem solving, and those gifts tend to make people skeptical. I'm a skeptic. When people say God did something or God told me something, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, yeah, right, you're going to have to prove it. I don't say that out loud, but that's kind of in my nature to be skeptical. But God performed some miracles for me so that I wouldn't become skeptical against him. I know that God exists and he performs miracles. Um, and I did enter a life of math and engineering and science, and in that environment, skepticism is held very highly. In fact, it's required. We don't assume anything. You have to prove everything as well as you can, uh, that it's real. You don't just trust your gut. Now, in this life where I was a skeptic and I was in a profession of skepticism, God still taught me things. He gave me evidence for my faith. There were undeniable miracles. This vision wasn't my last miracle. I did see a few more after that. I saw evidence for God in science. I studied evidence for the historicity of the New Testament. I studied archaeological evidence that supports the Bible. And I encountered testimonies of God's miraculous work in other people. All these things work together to continue to strengthen my confidence that God was real. Now, another lesson that I learned is that God guides. God guided me to a future through this vision that he gave me. But how does God guide? Does he always guide by visions? Well, God guides us as he chooses. God is sovereign, and he'll decide how he wants to guide us, or if he wants to guide us. For me, there were no more visions. This vision was a one-time thing. Nothing like that has ever happened since, never happened before. That was a special case. Um, he did perform miracles and guide me in some pretty impressive ways, but the wow factor of God's guidance diminished over time. The more I grew in my faith, the less God guided me through miraculous, impressive things. Sometimes he'd, work the circumstances in my life so things would work out. But mostly he just left me to make my own decisions through godly wisdom. God had taught me things, and I was supposed to choose wisely in decisions I made. So growing up in faith doesn't mean that God will guide you supernaturally. In my life, the supernatural guidance actually diminished over time, and that seems to be the case for most people. But I know there are some people, as they mature in their faith, God works amazing miracles in their life. Now, there are some contrasts between grown-up and childish faith that have come out in this talk, and some things that haven't come out in this talk, but I want to summarize a few things. When you're grown up, you tend to be more free from sin. Spiritual infancy or childishness keeps you trapped in sin. As you mature in your faith, you're able to love others better. When your faith is childish, sometimes you hate people. You have trouble avoiding that instinct to hate. Spiritual maturity makes us more gentle in dealing with other people. Childish faith tends to be harsh and gets angry easy. When we're grown up in our faith, we're more disciplined. Childish faith is lazy. Grown-up faith has more wisdom. Childish faith is more foolish. Grown-up faith is more forgiving. Childish faith tends to hold grudges and has resentment. Grown-up faith develops a pure heart. Childish faith develops a hard heart. Grown-up faith is more friendly and courteous to other people. Childish faith is sometimes rude, sarcastic, and mocking. Grown-up faith is sensitive to others. We don't hurt other people as often. Childish faith is actually easily offended and gets hurt easily. Excuse me. This list could go on, and these things that I've mentioned, you could preach a whole sermon or a series of sermons on any one of them. People have written books on these things. But I want to kind of come up with a short summary of grown-up faith. So what does grown-up faith mean to me? It's childlike. It's not childish. It involves spiritual discipline. Godly wisdom is developed in grown-up faith, especially when you have to deal with difficult and uncertain issues. You exercise godly wisdom in those. And possibly more than anything else, perseverance. We're able to persevere in our faith through challenges and difficulties. That's what grown-up faith means to me. And here's my final chart that summarizes those things. Thank you for watching.